Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's discussion on the legacy of Nancy Reagan. My name is Emily Souza Rakowski, and I'm a second-year graduate student pursuing my master's in public policy here at the Harris School. I have been a huge Institute of Politics enthusiast through my time here at U of C, and previously served as an IOP Fellows Ambassador. I am delighted to introduce our guests today, starting with our featured speaker, Karen Tumulty. Ms. Tumulty is a political columnist for the Washington Post, where she has worked since 2010. Her impressive career also includes long-term roles as a national political correspondent for Time magazine and journalist at the LA Times. No stranger to the IOP, Ms. Tumulty serves on the board of advisors and was an IOP Fellow in the fall of 2017. Welcome back. Ms. Tumulty is here today to discuss her new book, The Triumph of Nancy Reagan. Having read her essay entitled How Nancy Reagan Helped End the Cold War, which appeared on the Washington Post on April 1st, I am eager to hear more about the book, and the years of research that went into it. Our moderator this afternoon is Kate Andersen Brower, a successful author in her own right. Her best-selling books give insight into the inner workings of the White House and those who live and work there, including presidents, vice presidents, and first ladies. Ms. Andersen Brower is also a CNN contributor and covered the Obama administration for Bloomberg News. I'd also like to note that Shonda Rhimes has optioned her book, The Residents, for Netflix, so that's something else to look forward to. On behalf of the IOP community, thank you both for being here. Now I will turn it over to Kate.
Emily, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm very excited to be here with Karen, who I've long admired as a journalist. And I told her earlier, I loved her book. I couldn't put it down. And to me, reading a biography of someone so hugely famous, who I think a lot of us think we already know, and then to discover so many new things about her was really refreshing, and also to see it written from a empathetic point of view, I thought was really fascinating. So Karen, thank you for sharing this book with us. And I guess I wanted to kick off the conversation asking you what made you tackle the subject of Nancy Reagan, who has been written about quite a bit and wrote her own memoir, which is kind of an amazing book, My Turn. But I was wondering what was your inspiration?
Well, thank you so much, Kate, and thank you, Emily. And let me say, first of all, how delighted I am to be back at the IOP, even virtually, because so much of my research for this book was actually done while I was a fellow at the IOP, where, for one thing, it was like whatever I was looking for, it seemed like the University of Chicago could dig it up for me, but it also gave me an opportunity for 7 weeks to sort of try and inhabit the Chicago world of the 1930s and the 1940s, in which then Nancy Davis lived. But the short answer here is this book was not my idea. Priscilla Payton, my editor, who's the chief of nonfiction at Simon & Schuster, came to me in the fall of 2016. And over the years, she and I had talked about all kinds of book ideas, and nothing really sort of grabbed me. And the truth is, I was a little scared about my own abilities to even write a book. But there was something about the idea of doing Nancy Reagan, who had died just a few months before that struck me that I knew the caricatures of her, that she was either a shallow socialite who didn't care about anything but fashion and China and redecorating, or that she was a scheming power behind the throne. I just knew there had to be an interesting story there somewhere. And I did spend the next 4.5 years digging into what I thought was a book about a woman and a marriage. It turned out to be a book about a presidency, and her role in her husband's rise and in his presidency. And I'm not just talking about being his closest advisor. She actually affected major policies of the Reagan administration, and at its moment of greatest peril during the Iran-Contra scandal, she literally ran the rescue operation from inside the White House. So it took really a couple of years of research before all these little sort of threads of Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan and kind of what it was that brought them together, what bound them so closely together, began to make a clear picture for me. And, Nancy Reagan was not without her flaws, was not without her demons, and I do not shrink from any of that in this book. But I do think she was a figure of historic significance.
I think one of the things that makes us compassionate towards her is her childhood, right? And you get into that with a lot of detail in the book. And I'm wondering, how do you think her childhood, her mother leaving her with relatives, and then, remarrying, and this sense of kind of the idea that she was a social climber, I think was always something that kind of stuck with me. But you almost give us a sense that she wanted stability in her life because she felt that she didn't really have, that people were going to leave her all the time. And that really sticks with you as a young kid, I think. So I guess if you could talk a bit about how her childhood shaped her and later her marriage and her approach to motherhood herself, because she had that terrible relationship with her children. And I'm wondering if you uncovered anything particularly interesting about her early years.
Well, so Nancy, she was born Anne Frances Robbins in 1921, although for decades she would lie about it and claim it was 1923. But she was the product of a bad match between an actress and an unsuccessful car salesman. And really, by the time she arrived, her parents' marriage was already over. They went their separate ways very shortly after she was born. And then as soon as she was out of diapers, her mother decides to just leave her with relatives for the next 6 years so that Edith Luckett Robbins could pursue her own career. And as their son Ron told me, that really cast a shadow. These 6 years of this little girl just yearning for this absent mother, yearning for a normal family, casts a shadow on Nancy Reagan that never really lifts. And she is constantly convinced that no matter how successful she is, how charmed her life might be, the whole bottom could drop out at any moment. And then that is kind of confirmed for her 2 months into her husband's presidency, and we've just passed the 40th anniversary of the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. He came far closer to death that day than the White House let the country know at the time. But for Nancy Reagan, that seems to just confirm everything. And her anxiety at that point is just stratospheric. And it really does drive her to do a lot of very, in some ways, irrational things, including most famously relying on an astrologer to determine the comings and goings, the daily schedule of the most powerful man in the world. I think there's a big difference between her and Ronald Reagan here in that Reagan was deeply, deeply grounded in religious faith. And he believed that God had spared him from this assassin's bullet because God had a purpose for him. And Nancy Reagan was not raised in that tradition. In fact, her stepfather, and I should probably get back to her mother, was an atheist. So she is just like grabbing onto anything and can give her a sense of control. But anyway, so back to her mother. So when in 1929, Edith, her mother, appears back in her life and announces that she is getting remarried a neurosurgeon. Now, this is the 1920s. You can imagine what a path breaker it would be to be a neurosurgeon in the 1920s. She has met Dr. Loyal Davis on a cruise to Europe, and that she's moving to Chicago. She is getting married, and Nancy's moving with them. And so enters the second most important man in Nancy's life, this stepfather that she worships. But what you also see with Edith is that her talents as a networker far exceed anything she ever does on the stage. So that while Loyal Davis, who's a kind of cold, forbidding figure, certainly has his professional accomplishments, it is really Edith and her networking in political circles, in theater circles, in charity circles, basically propels this couple into the cream of Chicago society. And as Nancy's stepbrother said to me, stepbrother is a product of Loyal Davis's first marriage. He said, really, in Edith's marriage to my father, you can see the pattern of Nancy's marriage to the president. So her mother finally brings her the stability she craves, but also the template for the kind of marriage that would provide it, and, you know, what her role could be in that marriage.
You talk about Nancy being the street fighter in this relationship. She handled all the nasty business. I think that you quoted Edmund Morris saying that. Did that street fighter attitude come from her mother, in a sense, that there was this kind of veneer of, you know, cocktail parties and schmoozing, but really if someone crossed Ronnie, they were out? I mean, famously, right, she got rid of Don Regan. And so I'm wondering, are there other examples of times where she, you know, injected herself and basically got people fired because she didn't think they were loyal to him?
Oh, from the beginning. And the thing to understand about Ronald Reagan is he comes from his own difficult childhood. He is the child of an alcoholic. It leaves him with a kind of detachment. As much as people remember him as affable, genial, having this incredible talent at connecting with the American people, he is a very solitary figure, a very conflict-averse figure. Nancy comes out of her childhood with this incredibly attuned instinct about people, a real radar for trouble. As James Baker, later Secretary of State under Bush, but under the Reagans, White House Chief of Staff, told me, her instincts were incredible. In fact, they were better than his. So when Ronald Reagan decides to go into politics, his agent, a guy named Taft Schreiber, is having lunch with his political consultant. And he says, you know what, you're going to have to find somebody who can fire people, because this guy's never going to do it. He's just too conflict averse. And really that becomes Nancy's role. And yes, Don Regan, most famously White House Chief of Staff, she gets him fired, but she's also a major reason that, for instance, the Reagan administration went through 6 national security advisors.
It's amazing that she was able to protect him. You know, you say, and I think one of the best points in this book, and I haven't heard it referred to this way before, is that Reagan was the Teflon president, as we know, but that means Nancy was the Velcro first lady. Everything stuck to her, like you said, with the China, even though it was all private donations, I think, right? And the redecoration of the residence. What was it? She knew how to craft his image so well. Why couldn't she do the same for herself, or did she not care?
She is just, that is the great sort of conundrum about her, as attuned and as you know, perfectly attuned as she is to protecting his image. She's, for a long time, very, very clueless about her own. Reagan takes office during the worst economic recession since the Great Depression. And this is not the moment for a first lady to be going out and collecting hundreds of thousands of dollars from private donors to redecorate the private living quarters of the White House, or to be collecting from other donors enough money to buy $1,000 a place setting set of china. By the way, Eleanor Roosevelt also got in trouble for buying fancy china during the Great Depression, although she used government money to do it. So again and again and again, you just see her, even back in Sacramento, just really bringing a lot of her problems upon herself. And it really isn't until a couple of years into her husband's presidency that I think she recognizes that what a liability she herself is becoming, and potentially a real impediment to his success. At one point, very early on in the Reagan presidency, the New Hampshire Union Leader, this incredibly conservative newspaper in New Hampshire, famous publisher William Loeb is legendary in conservative circles. He writes a front page editorial where he compares the First Lady to Marie Antoinette.
And did she try to change her ways? I mean, she did the secondhand rose thing, right? Where she dressed. Can you talk a little bit about that and how she tried to lighten her image a little bit and poke fun at herself?
Well, she does. So right around the time of the gridiron dinner, it's a white tie dinner here in Washington, in 1982, Nancy brings yet another scandal upon herself when it is revealed that she has been, quote unquote, borrowing designer clothes. And I mean, we are talking outfits that cost thousands and thousands of dollars and not returning them, jewelry. So the gridiron dinner always involves this kind of show where reporters and singers get up and do parodies. And one of the parodies is of her to the old song Secondhand Rose, but they say secondhand clothes. What she decides to do that night is get up on stage and make fun of herself. So suddenly this song lambasting her is sung from the stage. The First Lady disappears from the head table. Everybody assumes it's because she's angry. But the next thing that happens is this tiny figure in this absolutely outlandish outfit, a big feathered hat and a feather boa down to her knees, steps onto the stage, and it's Nancy. And she gets up and sings a very hilarious parody of herself. And then she takes a piece of china that looks a lot like that $1,000 a place setting White House china and throws it down on the stage. And, it is at that point, I think, that we do see the very first cracks in her Ice Queen image. The President Reagan then gets up and says, well, I came here thinking I was a happy husband, and now I realize I'm just another stage door Johnny.
Was that her idea to do, by the way, or did somebody kind of talk her into doing it? I always
the idea itself came from her press secretary, a very shrewd woman named Sheila Tate. But as soon as she heard the idea, as soon as James Baker, the White House chief of staff, hear the idea, they think it's genius. And originally, the Gridiron Club suggested that she throw this back at the press and do a song making fun of the press. But they recognize that the only way this is going to work is if she makes fun of herself and shows that she has a little bit of humility and a sense of humor.
Which First Lady did she model herself after, Karen? Do you think I would think Jackie Kennedy would be someone she would have admired, but, Jackie did the restoration project of the state floor, and Nancy Reagan just mostly did the second floor, which I think is curious why she wouldn't do more that was for public viewing. But I guess I wonder, is that her kind of style icon? And also, is that the person she wants most to be like as First Lady?
I think that is probably what she was thinking. And when Jackie Kennedy does this, it is shown on national television. Jackie Kennedy actually wins an Emmy for this program. But Jackie Kennedy was doing it in Camelot, not in the middle of a recession. And it was really interesting, though, because at the, some of the hardest times of the first year, this terribly rocky first year for Nancy Reagan, she gets a letter from Jackie Kennedy saying, "You're going to get through this. Don't worry about it." But she says, in the meantime, you might want to quit reading the newspapers.
That's very sweet. I think they have the sense of, there are only a few people in the world who know what that position is like, right? And I wondered about Nancy Reagan's relationship with Barbara Bush.
Oh, they despised each other. They absolutely despised each other.
Why? What was that about?
Well, let's start with the 1980 campaign, the primary. It was brutal. George Bush and Ronald Reagan just going at each other. And Nancy Reagan was not a big fan of him picking George Bush, then H.W. Bush, to be his running mate. And, sometimes I think the principals, until now they've all been men, but sometimes I think the spouses have a little harder time than the principals themselves sometimes letting go of all this. And certainly Barbara Bush never let her forget who she thought should have been sitting in the Oval Office, not attending funerals of foreign leaders. But there's also a couple of other things going on. Barbara Bush can trace her roots to the Mayflower. She comes from the Eastern establishment. Nancy Reagan is seen as part of this parvenu Hollywood culture. Barbara Bush also has a closet full of designer clothes, but she is just bathed in glowing coverage. She is America's grandmother, and while Nancy Reagan is just getting brutalized. But I think also on a very kind of fundamental level, Barbara Bush awakens a lot of Nancy Reagan's insecurities. The Bushes are surrounded by this large, loving, functional family, kids, grandkids, and the Reagans, and we can talk about this a little more, are incredibly dysfunctional. There is not that. And so you can really see that on a number of levels, these two women are going to despise each other. And in fact, the Reagans almost never invited the Bushes even to come up to the residence. And people were very shocked when Joe Biden said recently that he had never been in the White House residence while the Obamas were living there, and that people were very shocked about this. This is not, I immediately thought of the Reagans and the Bushes.
I was surprised by that too, because the Bidens and the Obamas were close, certainly closer than the Reagans and the Bushes. And I completely agree that it's interesting that George Bush 41 and Reagan were able to have this decent partnership, this good partnership, and then to have the two wives kind of dislike each other so much is kind of a sad thing. And I don't know if the press also pits women against each other too.
I think so. And another factor here, by the way, is that George H.W. Bush takes office as vice president, intent on running for president himself in 1988. And whenever you have a vice president in a White House, and we've seen it over and over and over again, I certainly saw it when I was covering the Clintons and the Gores, there is always a bit of suspicion when the vice president does anything, that the president's circle is always wondering if he is carrying out the president's agenda or whether he has his eye on his own political future.
I think you can't talk about Nancy Reagan without delving in deeper, as you said, to her relationship with her children. And she dedicates her memoir, to Ronnie, who always understood, and to my children, who I hope will understand. I always thought, what a dig, but what do you say? What is that message, that her kids don't understand the relationship that she has with her husband? Because they always said, that the two of them, their parents were like on an island, separate from the children. What was that dynamic like in that family?
Yeah, and at one point in her memoir, Nancy Reagan writes, "All I ever wanted was to be a good wife and mother, and I guess I succeeded at one and not the other." The Reagans are bound together so closely. I mean, and again, Ronald Reagan is this very solitary figure. He is close to exactly one person in the world, but they are bound together so closely that even their children feel shut out. There were two from Reagan's first marriage to the actress Jane Wyman, and then there are two children they had together. Reagan and Wyman actually had a third child, a baby, Christine, who survived. She was born very prematurely. As they are trying to save their marriage, the baby lives for less than a day. But always, each of the four Reagan children in their own way feels shut out by their parents. One little detail I found fascinating was that Michael is the son from the first marriage. And on the day of his first wedding, the Reagans decide to go to Tricia Nixon's wedding in Washington instead of his own son's wedding.
Wow. I didn't know that. That's, oh gosh. And is that part of this lifelong grudge that Michael then has? I mean, he didn't go to her funeral, right?
Right.
And another thing that you have in the book that I had never heard of was that Michael had been, sexually assaulted. And there's a scene in the book that you describe him telling his parents, and that was just being so emotionally vulnerable. How did you discover that? I mean, maybe I missed it.
Well, he wrote about it in his own autobiography. And one thing, though, that I was really struck by in this scene, he is an adult by this point. He is at the Reagan Ranch, and he is abused by a camp counselor in summer camp who also took photographs of him. So Michael Reagan is tormented his whole life by the idea, as his father is getting famous and going up in politics, knowing that there are these photographs out there of him as a child being sexually abused, and terrified that these are going to become public. So finally, he decides to tell Ronald and Nancy Reagan. By then, Reagan is president. And Reagan just can't sort of comprehend what his son is trying to tell him. But you really see Nancy step up in there, and she's like, "Ronnie, be quiet, let him tell his story." And then she begins to sort of ask him the questions that bring out this whole horrifying secret that Michael Reagan has been living with his whole life. Mm-hmm. And it is really interesting because it is at that moment that is the first time he ever tells Nancy Reagan that he loves her.
That's just an amazing story. And you're right. I mean, the way it reads is that she kind of says, what he's trying to tell you is this, Ronnie, right, that this happened. Had you come across stories about her being abusive to Patty? I think Patty wrote about that, right? That she had been beaten by Nancy Reagan. What was your feeling about that in your reporting? Do you think that was true, or what have you heard about it?
Well, I sort of let each of the Reagan children tell this story their own way. And when I was talking to Ron and asking him about Patty's accounts of her mother sort of regularly slapping her, his response is, "Well, I don't quite remember our household being quite like this. Is her story. She can tell it." He said, "We weren't abusive." He says, "Jane Wyman used to beat those kids with a riding crop." And in fact, Michael writes that in his book, that his adoptive mother, Jane Wyman, when he was naughty, would beat him with a riding crop on each of his legs. I think that, there was a little, spare the rod, spoil the child here, discipline theories of the 1950s, but this is pretty horrifying.
What was the thing that you learned after 4 years, which is a long time of being immersed in this topic, that surprised you the most about her?
I really do think it was her impact on policy. And I have a long essay that I would really recommend. It's an excerpt from the book that was in the Washington Post on the very real impact that she had on the end of the Cold War. And this was described to me in great detail by George Shultz, who was their Secretary of State. James Baker, for the guys who were smart enough, for the guys in the Reagan White House, James Baker, in fact, is White House Chief of Staff, primarily because Nancy Reagan, he barely knew the Reagans at the end of the 1980 campaign, but it is Nancy Reagan who really brings him in and gives him the top job of the White House. So the men in that White House who were smart enough to understand her power and recognize her power found her to be an invaluable ally when it came time to sort of make sure the right people are in the room around her husband, to talk to him about an issue. The guys, the people, they were primarily men, but the people who were not in her favor in that White House tended not to last for very long.
Right. You don't hang up the phone on Nancy Reagan, right?
Right.
What was the biggest, I think the assassination attempt would probably be your answer to the biggest challenge and the biggest kind of defining moment for her. But Iran-Contra was probably another one where suddenly things were not looking so good for them. And I'm wondering what role she played in trying to get his, approval ratings up, because wasn't that a period of real, it looked like Reagan was suddenly in trouble.
It is the first time that, and the polling shows it, that the country believed Ronald Reagan wasn't being truthful with them. So Nancy Reagan, first of all, we're back to Reagan, conflict averse, ultimate optimist, this is all going to blow over. I never did anything wrong. Nancy Reagan recognizes that he is in very real danger of being impeached. The Senate has just gone over to Democratic control. Investigations are starting on the Hill. So she does two things. One is she engineers a needed shakeup of the White House staff, starting at the top with the chief of staff. She gets on her husband about this in ways that really strain the marriage. To the point where the president is quoted as having screamed at her, "Get off my goddamn back." She does that, but just as importantly, maybe more importantly, she convinces the president that he must acknowledge to the country and to himself that what he did was pay ransom for US hostages in the Middle East, that he sold weapons to America's enemy, Iran, in exchange for getting hostages out. And that was something he had absolutely promised he would never do. But he finally, on a televised speech, and again, she doesn't even trust the West Wing to write this speech. She brings in her own speechwriter. He acknowledges it. And overnight, he has restored this bond of trust with the country. But I really think that in some ways, her most shining moment is after he's president. Most presidents are around for decades after they leave office. They really get to sort of write the first draft of their own legacies themselves. Ronald Reagan is diagnosed with Alzheimer's very soon after he leaves office. So it really falls on Nancy's shoulders to become the guardian, the shaper, and the protector of his legacy, in addition to being the, caretaker of his physical well-being. And as the country sees these last 10 years of Ronald Reagan's life, and they see the stoicism, it is the first time that people truly believe that this devoted gaze that she has been fixing on her husband, that she's been mocked for all these years, is genuine. And, the country really does begin to look at her in a different way. In some ways, becoming the guardian of his legacy is her final gift to him. But for the acclaim that she finally got for this, she just paid the highest price imaginable.
He wrote that really beautiful letter. Did she help him write it? Was she no, oh, interesting. Or did you want him to write it to explain what was going on?
It is, this is 1994, and the diagnosis that they have been trying to avoid, to deny, and I go into all the different little signs that Reagan was showing in the couple of years before that, becomes unavoidable. So they have a meeting with the doctors in the residence in the Bel Air section of California. And it is Reagan's idea that he is going to have to make some kind of statement to the country. So he sits down at a little table near a window and writes this beautiful letter explaining what has happened to him. And then he hands it to his chief of staff, Fred Ryan. He says, now type this up. And it is Nancy and Fred Ryan who say, no, we're not typing this. The country needs to see this letter in your handwriting to know that these are, in fact, Ronald Reagan's words, Ronald Reagan's thoughts. And the letter is just so extraordinary and so powerful.
It's very moving. It's really, really honest and raw. And then she goes on this stem cell crusade, right? And that again brings her with the Bush family, but Bush 43 this time, kind of at loggerheads. Can you talk about, I almost wonder if she had a better relationship with Barbara Bush, if she could have leveraged that at that time, or what, it was just it would be too difficult to get Bush 43 to sign on to what she wanted, right?
Although oddly enough, she and 43 really liked each other. In fact, for astrology buffs, they both had a July 6th birthday. That might have been something to do with it. And she actually has a warmer personal relationship with George W. Bush. But, she is the daughter of a neurosurgeon. She believes in science. She sees in stem cell research the potential, it's too late to help her husband, but the potential that maybe other families wouldn't have to go through what she is going through. So, but she doesn't want to create a problem for Bush 43 because stem cell research, the most promising treatments involve the destruction of the cells of embryos. It raises all kinds of issues with the, anti-abortion movement. So she sends Bush a private letter saying, I know more than most people what you were facing in this decision. It was a decision at NIH whether to use existing lines of stem cells for research. And she makes this incredible appeal to him. Again, she does it privately. She's hurt because it takes him weeks and weeks and weeks to even answer her letter. But she finally decides that, and this is shortly before Reagan dies, she is at a dinner where Michael J. Fox, another advocate of stem cell research, a sufferer of Parkinson's disease, is being honored. And it is there that Nancy Reagan gets up and announces her, and again, very controversial with the right, support for stem cell research. And a lot of Reagan's allies go ballistic over that. And Michael Deaver, who was a very close aide to the Reagans, recalled getting a call from someone saying Ronald Reagan would never have supported this. And to which Michael Deaver replies, well, Ronald Reagan hasn't had to spend the last 10 years taking care of Ronald Reagan.
So she really stood up for what she believed in.
She did. And interestingly enough, too, people forget Ronald Reagan, as governor of California, signed the most liberal abortion law in the country. Although he is later, he is all along really, a great opponent of abortion rights. But Nancy Reagan announces in 1994, after he is out of office, she says, yeah, I'm against abortion too, but I really think it ought to be a woman's choice.
I know we have to go to questions soon, but one thing I want to make sure I ask you, because of the moment that we're in right now, where, racial justice is so much at the center of our national conversation. And it makes me think back to the war on drugs, right? And DARE and all of that she was behind. Just Say No. Do you think that her campaign, I mean, you talk about it in the book, but do you think it was ultimately successful for the time, or did it lead to more incarcerations and problems? Because later, in recent years, people have looked back on that and thought it was very one-dimensional and not necessarily well thought out. So what do you make of Just Say No?
I think you have to separate that from the Reagan administration's policies. Just Say No. It was a very simple slogan, simplistic. You could also argue it was easy to dismiss. But I have found research that it was aimed at little kids. It was aimed at elementary school kids. And you do see there's something called the Monitoring the Future Project, where you can see that the attitudes of young children toward, do you think it's okay to smoke marijuana? Do you think it's okay for your friends? Would you be critical of a friend if they did it? You really do see attitudes of kids change during the 80s. And then once the Reagans are gone, they change back. But the policies of the Reagan administration were, yes, that drug abuse was not a health issue. It was a law enforcement issue. They incarcerated a lot of people, a lot of men of color. And so a lot of people thought, well, Just Say No was just this kind of family-friendly cover. And, there's justification for that. But there is a moment close to the end of her husband's presidency where Nancy Reagan goes to the United Nations and gives a speech. And she criticizes her own husband's administration because they are trying to, crack down on suppliers overseas, the campesino in Peru or the poppy grower in Afghanistan. And she said, unless we are willing to deal also with the investment banker who goes out and scores some cocaine on his lunch hour, we're not going to solve this problem. We've got to think about our own demand side here. Mm-hmm. It is a much more balanced message on drugs. It was a great relief to a lot of the delegates from other countries who were in the audience. But as George Shultz told me, the drug bureaucracy in the Reagan administration went bananas. The speech makes the front page, and Shultz said they were really trying to get her to kind of tone down the message that this drug problem is this country's fault as much as it's any other country's fault.
What do you, now we're in 2021, we have this pandemic that has really changed the country for a year. I'm wondering why you think she matters now. What is a lesson we can learn from her as First Lady, or maybe something that you'd want Dr. Biden to read in this book?
Well, the thing about First Ladies is that each of them has to figure out this job on their own. Each of them knows their husband, knows his strengths, knows his weaknesses. But as I write in the book, when the word powerful is used about a first lady, it's never intended as a compliment. And so, I just hope, again, I think that Nancy Reagan, for all of her flaws, for all of her demons, is a figure of historic significance in her own right, and that she was exactly the partner that Ronald Reagan needed. Other presidents have other kinds of partners, and I don't know, I've always been fascinated with seeing so many of these first ladies find their own way. And certainly we've seen more than a few have a rough go of it in the last couple of decades.
It does seem to me, though, that people want to like the first lady, right? There is a sense that even we saw with Melania Trump at the beginning, her approval ratings were better than his. But then they would, when she would seem more aligned with her husband, I think that always broke badly for her. She did more interviews. I feel like with first ladies, there's a sense of how much do we want to hear from them? And do you feel like Nancy Reagan was ever able to really be herself, and that, you're right, they never really can be. And she never wanted people to know how influential she was, right? So what great pains did she take to hide that influence in public, do you think?
I think that if she had shown a little more vulnerability, a little more complexity, that people would have understood her better and might have even loved her for it. And I write about other first ladies in the book. Who really transformed the role was Betty Ford.
Yeah.
Who stands up, disagrees with her husband about the Equal Rights Amendment. She said, just because I'm first lady doesn't mean I have to shut up. And at one point, the White House press secretary in the Ford administration says, the president long ago gave up any idea that he could keep his wife from saying what she thought. And Rosalind Carter, she was criticized for sitting in on cabinet meetings and National Security Council meetings. Like, how dare she? Our expectations of our first ladies, we have just been so hard on so many of them.
I think that I totally agree about Betty Ford and what she did after she left the White House. I mean, when she was in the White House, she talked about her breast cancer diagnosis. Then she left and she talked about addiction. And I think that there was something that Nancy Reagan was never able to make herself vulnerable, right? One student wanted to know about, they're asking a question that I kind of already asked, but how did or might she have considered the mixed views of her lasting impact on the Black community in America? So, I mean, do you think that, I guess you already answered the war on drugs, but she kind of had an outdated view. I mean, I think you have to look at her in the context of the time, but I don't know if she was outspoken in terms of, I certainly wouldn't consider her a feminist, right? And I don't know where she stood on issues of race either. Was she someone who was more forward-looking than her husband, more progressive than her husband?
In many respects, she was, but I do think there is a real silence on the subject of race. Again, there are people who will draw a through line from our problems in the country today to the Reagan administration. I think you can actually go back to the Nixon campaign strategies to see some of the underpinnings of our racial problems in this country. And even LBJ, when he signs the Voting Rights Act, realizes that essentially he's giving the South away to the Republicans. So again, the through lines of a lot of our racial issues in this country, and thank goodness that we do seem to be having a moment of reckoning here, although it seems like every day's news is another reminder of how far we have to go. This is a subject that you just really have to take a really long lens on.
Mm-hmm. I wondered if and we talked a bit about this in the virtual green room, but we talked about how the Secret Service relied on her to get Reagan to wear his bulletproof vest, which Reagan called his iron t-shirt. And I just thought it was interesting that, Nancy Reagan rarely wore hers. And yet you describe in the book kind of this look that she would exchange with the Secret Service when it was time for him to make an appearance, I guess on a day where Joan Quigley said it was okay to go out. How did that play out? And how did the Secret Service kind of use her to get him to comply?
Well, first of all, people need to recognize, and till the assassination attempt, where John Hinckley gets within feet of the president and, shoots three other people in the space of a few seconds. Everything changed about security. Believe it or not, before that, they didn't even have metal detectors outside the White House. They didn't have the magnetometers that you have to go through, like in the airport. And the Secret Service, once they are allowed to put them up after the assassination attempt, are horrified or shocked to discover that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tourists a year have been walking around the White House with concealed weapons. So there is always going to be tension between the political people and the Secret Service. The Secret Service, if they had their druthers, they would wrap the president in bulletproof saran wrap, never let him out. The political people always want the president out there, touching people, putting him in situations where people can feel like they know their president, that they have a physical connection with him. So you always got to have this tension. Nancy Reagan became the best friend the Secret Service ever had, as one of the head of his detail told me. If we ever had a problem, we just knew we need to go to her and we'd get it fixed. And that would sometimes involve overseas trips, not allowing him to do outdoor events, even though at some points that even caused diplomatic incidents. I think people don't realize Ronald Reagan never traveled to the Middle East, never even Israel. So there's, she did become a great ally of the Secret Service.
We have a written question from Alexandra Patsakis. She's a third year in the college, and she's asking, can you discuss Nancy Reagan's role as First Lady of California? And did she approach that role any differently than she did the role of being First Lady of the United States?
So he's elected governor in 1966, this movie actor. And all of a sudden, the Reagans go from Hollywood, where, the studio handles your publicity. They can make up a story and the gossip columnists will just eat it up, and into politics, where, it's a different kind of spotlight. Every flaw is accentuated. She has a very tough time of it in Sacramento. Her husband's staff hates her. I mean, they just think she is the biggest pain. They hear from her first thing in the morning, they hear from her at night. If there are cigarette butts in the ashtrays, they hear from her. But you do see over the course of those 8 years in Sacramento, and over the course of 2.5 presidential campaigns, she becomes much shrewder, much more sophisticated. And, by the time they get to the White House, yes, she makes some huge, huge errors, but she has figured out politics in a way that, again, her years in Sacramento were quite rocky by and large.
I keep wondering what she would think of Dr. Biden teaching. Do you think she would approve? And did she ever talk about whether First Lady should have a job?
Well, actually, I have in the book a letter that she got from a young woman, a newlywed, asking, what's the secret of a successful marriage? And she has this very retro idea. She says, well, maybe some people could combine a job and a marriage, but I think one of them is going to suffer. And I was not willing to take that chance with my marriage. She's very retro, very pre-feminist about this. And, oddly enough, for this woman who is so powerful and, so combative even, she really does have very, very pre-feminist views, which is one reason that a lot of her harshest coverage came from younger women who were journalists, who really, the feminist movement is blossoming in the 60s and the 70s. And they see Nancy Reagan as essentially, a symbol of everything they're rebelling against.
Mm-hmm. I think she had that in common with Barbara Bush, right? Because when Barbara went to I think it was either Smith or Wellesley, but they then gave the speech, right? And it was like she was thrown at. Yeah,
she went to, I'm sorry, she gives a speech at Wellesley, but it's interesting because Barbara Bush is a few years behind Nancy at Smith College. They never knew each other, but Nancy actually graduated from Smith College, as she was, would like to point out. And Barbara Bush drops out her freshman year to marry George Bush. And yet, when it comes time for Smith to give an honorary degree, they snub Nancy and give one to Barbara.
Oh, that's funny. I didn't realize that, because there was that kind of controversy about Barbara's speech. Like, some students said, well, she's only here because of her husband. And that was true, right? Of these women who, I often wonder if some of them, Lady Bird Johnson, for instance, was probably as, politically astute, and as you said, Nancy Reagan too, Rosalind Carter, they had the political instincts.
And Nancy did have a career until she got married, unlike a lot of our first ladies. She was an actress. She was signed by MGM. One of my favorite little tiny bits of trivia in the book that I explain in a footnote where it comes from is that when MGM Studios, the powerhouse of star-making factories in Hollywood, offers a contract in 1949 to this sort of undistinguished actress, Nancy Davis, that is one of the reasons they turned down giving a contract to Marilyn Monroe.
Oh, God.
Surely the worst business decision ever made by any studio in the history of Hollywood.
Big mistake. What advice would you give journalists now at University of Chicago, people who are studying journalism? What do you think in your career has been something that I know it's kind of a broad question, but that you think continues to be very, very important in journalism today? Because journalism has changed so much even in the past 10 years, but the past 20, 30 years, hugely. And what do you see as something that you think is always going to be important?
Well, first of all, can I just say, and I write about this in the acknowledgments of my book, I was so grateful for my time at the University of Chicago, and for more than any other reason, by how inspired I was by the students I met, by their idealism, by their smarts, by their energy. And so I just cannot tell you how much I admired the young people that I met in those 7 weeks that I was sitting up there in that office. But I think for a journalist, and certainly for me working on this book, I just followed the facts. I tried to come at it with no preconceptions of where I was going to end up. And it really did make the journey that much more fascinating.
One final question from Nil. What was the toughest challenge you encountered while writing the book?
Oh boy, if I ever write another book, it was just sort of organizing myself. And at one point, I had a very generous Edmund Morris, a Pulitzer Prize winning biographer who had more access to Ronald Reagan than anybody else. His book ended up being something of a literary disaster. But he was very kind. He invited me over to his house. He died not long after that, and let me go through his files, things that had never been published in his own book. Wow. And I was able to see how organized this man was, and how he had his research just all laid out. And I realized, oh my God, I'm just a mess.
Did you do an outline? I asked this because I had no do and regret it.
No, it's because this was Simon & Schuster's idea. I walk into this with no book proposal, no outline, and for much of the first year, just convinced I'd made a terrible mistake. And then one night, when I'm having one of my many, many sleepless nights worrying about this, I'm deep into a Lou Cannon biography of Reagan. And there's this one sentence, and it says, Ronald Reagan always knew where he wanted to go, but she had a better sense of what it was going to take to get there. And I went, oh my God, I have found my North Star. So I told that to Lou, and he said, I don't even remember writing that.
And thank him for getting you to, because the hardest part of writing is sitting down and actually doing it, right? It's the research is not as hard as the putting it down pen to paper. Well, thank you, Karen. It's a wonderful read, and thanks to the students, the IOP, and it was really delightful to talk with you. And I'm so honored to get the chance to talk to you all, and thank you all very much.
And thank you so much.